To say that our Lutheran schools, namely our LCMS schools, are struggling is really to state the obvious. I think most people agree. There is disagreement, however, in identifying the nature and cause of this struggle. Many of those in Lutheran education point to a plethora of factoids, suggesting the real problem is that our schools are not keeping up with present-day trends in such things as visionary leadership, school models to replace the old curmudgeonly German Lutheran ones, and educator professionalism, whose skill sets accomplish servant and spiritual leadership. And I believe this is true, that if you can't find Lutherans with those desired attributes, any Christian will do, and maybe not even Christian in some cases. They say that we need to adapt to a new era where the school finds ways to include diverse enrollees, also in some circles called paying entities, in equitable yet financially sustainable ways. Many supporters of this approach may argue that this should be accomplished while maintaining our Lutheran identity. Yet, they are also willing to compromise facets of that Lutheran identity in order to fulfill their vision of the greater good. At the 2013 LCMS Convention, Resolution 3-04 established a Blue Ribbon Committee. The Committee on Lutheran Schools was meant to address concerns and to provide recommendations. 6 years later, after modification and redefinition of the committee's charge in 2016, the committee issued their final report. The committee's working purpose statement was this: we want to maximize our ability to catalyze our discipleship through Lutheran education for the 56 million children in the United States. I don't really know what maximize our ability to catalyze our discipleship means. However, I do know that imported ambiguous language is precisely part of the problem. The 2019 report included several focus areas, particularly addressing reasons for decline and recommendations for growth. After gathering information via surveys, anecdotal evidence, demographic studies, and a list of qualities possessed by Lutheran pastors who were specifically identified as supportive, the conclusions for the cause of decline in Lutheran schools were as follows: aging population, family size, lack of denominational loyalty, that younger families were leaving for non-denominational churches. A paper could probably be given on that alone. Weakened catechesis, ineffective leadership, lack of strategic planning and decreased funding, increased divorce, breakdown of the family, weakened economy, a substantial increase of educational alternatives during the last 2 generations of students, secularization of America, and increased funding for public education. It was also noted that only 1/3 of those working in Lutheran education were on the roster, suggesting that a number of teachers in Lutheran schools were not members of a Lutheran congregation. And I will say that there are a number of Lutheran teachers who are not on the roster who are also teaching, such as my wife, who is one of those. When Reverend Freeman contacted me about delivering a paper at this conference, he asked me to address these questions. Why are LCMS schools struggling? Why do our Lutheran schools appear to be simply public schools with a religion class tacked on? And what can be done to fix it? I think the problem with our Lutheran schools may be deduced in large part from the 2019 Blue Ribbon Report. Snuggled almost unnoticed among the causes for decline was weakened catechesis. Only 2 of the 21 recommendations directly addressed the problem of weakened catechesis. These 2 recommendations said little to nothing about what to do or how to catechize. They simply stated that, quote, strong and distinctively Lutheran faith instruction, end quote, should be implemented and emphasized. The other 19 recommendations address such things as financial concerns, considerations for seeking and securing new means for strengthening schools, establishing a Lutheran Innovation Lab. I don't know what that is either. And a call for renewed support of our schools. It's my position that Lutheran schools in general, and I'm speaking generally here, have abandoned robust Lutheran catechesis. They have forgotten the best part of their Orthodox Lutheran history. Some have taken Lutheran out of their name in order to bolster a marketing scheme that attempts to name a Lutheran school according to the non-Lutherans they serve, rather than identifying themselves as Lutherans. In an effort to be all things to 56 million children in the United States, they have not sought first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. This paper will attempt to further explicate the reasons why Lutheran schools are embattled in a catechetical crisis and to suggest a way forward that is faithful to the Scriptures and the Lutheran confessions. The next section here, Mining the Lutheran Reformers, as a starting place for discussing Lutheran education. If we wish to consider what a Lutheran catechetical education today ought to look like, I suggest that we mine the best of the 16th century Lutheran reformers' thinking on education. Only after I had finished a bachelor's degree in secondary education and a master's degree in school leadership, both degrees from 2 institutions of our Concordia University system, did I ever seriously read or consider what Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, and Johannes Bugenhagen had to say about Lutheran education. What a treasure these theologians have to give us today. Why do I think it's good for us in the LCMS to hear from them today? These reformers thought about education in terms of biblical, evangelical, i.e. Lutheran, theology. They believed that doctrine is life. Dr. Robert Preuss once preached a sermon on Job 2:11-13 entitled The Importance of Making Theology Practical. Preuss quoted Abram Kalov, "Faith always involves action. Theology always involves practical activity," Kalov said. A little later in that same sermon, Preuss said, "If your theology is not doing anybody any good, don't theologize." By the way, if you don't have that little blue paperback book, I encourage you to get it. The reformers made no regular habit of abstract, speculative theology. Rather, they were exegetes of Christ's theology. They lived in the Savior's theology, and they most certainly built schools for children out of that same theology. Reformation schools were catechetical schools. In addition, I think that Lutherans in America have a similar situation in American schools that the Reformers had in German schools. And how is that so? The 16th century medieval educational system was in need of a theological and educational renaissance. And I believe the same is true today. In 1524, Luther voiced his concern to the leadership of the cities about the schools of Germany. Not only were the schools lacking in educational rigor, but moreover, they were un-Christian. Their religious instruction was either based upon the false doctrines of the Roman Church, or the scriptures were avoided altogether in their schools. Luther accused the pre-Reformation educational system of driving people away from the gospel. For Luther, this was the devil's trick. Luther wrote that Christian schools were to be established over unchristian schools, even if those schools only produced one single Christian. He said, "For one real Christian is better and can do more good than all the men on earth." In the large catechism on baptism, Luther wrote regarding practicing baptism. He said, "Therefore, let all Christians regard their baptism as the daily garment that they are to wear all the time. Every day they should be found in faith and with its fruits, suppressing the old creature and growing up in the new. If we want to be Christians," Luther wrote, "we must practice the work that makes us Christians and let those who fall away return to it." Johannes Bugenhagen was Luther's pastor and was also a significant school reformer in the 16th century. In 1528, Bugenhagen presented the Christian order of the Honorable City of Braunschweig. And when it was presented, they sang the Te Deum Laudamus, and they rang the city church bells. Bugenhagen's order for schools instructs in the evangelical faith, even as it provides a Christian order for Christian education. And I might note that when if you get a chance to read this, or if you have read it, Bugenhagen actually addresses schools first, and then he addresses the life of the congregation. For Bugenhagen, the order of schools must be rooted in the evangelical faith. The Braunschweig order for schools began with infant baptism as the theological context for educating children. If you want a beautiful sermon on baptism, read Bugenhagen. The theological entry point into Lutheran schools, baptism. For Bugenhagen, it was necessary for good schools to teach the baptized Luther's small catechism, all of it, with the explanations. In addition, baptized students were to sing the Psalms in Latin and to learn to read the Scriptures in Latin. Of course, other academic knowledge was to be learned too. Such a thoroughly Christian education was meant to teach the baptized that they might grow up to serve God, to serve in godly vocations, useful for church and society. And I should probably include family there, family, church, and society. After mastering Latin, the boys were to be taught Greek and Hebrew. They were to, quote, be taught with God's word and raised in the fear of God and in the Christian faith and life, end quote. Here's a glimpse into the catechesis of their schools. The boys in the Latin schools gathered for matins every weekday morning at 8 o'clock and for vespers at 2 o'clock. They prayed psalms, hymns, and the liturgy. The small catechism was recited word for word. The older boys were also responsible for chanting the Holy Scriptures. Except for the preaching, the boys sang, chanted, or read everything. Members from the parish were invited and encouraged to pray with them. If you get a chance to read Bugenhagen on this, he was very clear and methodical about how that was to happen. The scriptures were to be read both in Latin and in German. And the boys took turns reading the scriptures and also singing the liturgy that introduced the reading, the chanting of the introduction to the assignments. As early as 1527, several years after Luther's letter to the councilmen, the first official visitation of the churches and schools of electoral Saxony were made. In 1528, Philip Melanchthon, under Luther's observation and guidance, put together instructions for the visitors of parish pastors in electoral Saxony. It was a document that gave direction to congregation and schools in theological matters, church administration, and schools. It was to be stressed that children were not to be sent to schools simply so that they might get better jobs, but to prepare them for various vocations through which they were to serve their neighbors in the church and society. In the youngest classes, the little Germans were to be taught Latin first, and sometimes that's all they learned was Latin. German, Greek, and Hebrew were to be avoided in the younger grades so as to not cause confusion for the children. And yet, these languages were also to be taught later. Children were to be introduced to great literature, but gradually, learning an author well before taking on a more challenging one. The instructions carefully diagrammed the way in which the children were to be divided according to their abilities. There were 3 divisions. In the first division, the children were to learn the Latin alphabet, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the other prayers. They were to learn them all in Latin. When they had mastered this, they were to study Donatus and Cato. They were to learn how to speak well by imitating the schoolmaster. In other words, the schoolmaster stood as the example. Music was included, of course. They were to be given homework, something to memorize each evening, as wise teachers formerly have done in the schools, they said. The second division included children who had learned to read Latin well. They were to spend the first hour in the afternoon practicing music. Aesop's fables were to be read and understood. There's a wonderful book out on Luther's Aesop's that I would encourage you all to get a hold of as well. Other readings were to be learned, including the colloquies of Erasmus, Terence, and unobjectionable fables of Plautus. Of course, instruction in the catechism was required. Several psalms were chosen to be memorized, psalms such as 112, 34, 128, 125, 127, and 133. The Gospel of Matthew was to be well known, and that was before Dr. Scare was born, so it was still part of the curriculum. Then 1st and 2nd Timothy, 1st John, or Proverbs. Instructions were included for pedagogical methods, including recitation, what we today would call direct instruction, and memorization. The third division students were ready for Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Cicero's Officia. Having mastered grammar, these students studied the subjects of logic and rhetoric. They were to be well practiced in writing. And the writing was so that they might speak well. They wrote well that they might speak well. Third division students were required only to speak in Latin at school, as was the teacher. So in other words, you studied all your subjects in Latin, whether it was mathematics or whether it was reading one of the great authors. What was learned in school and how it was taught had to submit to the Holy Scriptures. By the way, they didn't read everything of the greats. They would pick and choose things that fit within the context of the Holy Scriptures. For Luther, there was no education better than that of the liberal arts. And I wish to emphasize that because that's really what I'm pointing toward. Such an education provided Rome with educated citizens. This is Luther's argumentation in service to the nation. Luther also extolled a liberal arts education as a wonderful blessing in service to the gospel. Luther anticipated the complaint against the liberal arts and subsequently defended his recommendation to reinstate this education in Germany. Luther said, "Alas, I am only too well aware that we Germans must always be and remain brutes and stupid beasts. Languages and the arts, which can do us no harm, but are actually a greater ornament, profit, glory, and benefit, both for the understanding of Holy Scripture and the conduct of temporal government, these we despise." Truly, he continues, if there were no other benefit connected with the languages, this should be enough to delight and inspire us, namely, that they are so fine and noble a gift of God, with which he is now so richly visiting and blessing us Germans above all other lands. We do not see many instances where the devil has allowed them to flourish by means of the universities and monasteries. Indeed, these have always raged against languages and are even now raging. For the devil smelled a rat and perceived that if the languages were revived, a hole would be knocked in his kingdom, which he could not easily stop up again. Since he found he could not prevent their revival, he now aims to keep them on such slender rations that they will of themselves decline and pass away. By the way, I think that's already beginning in our circles today as revival of the liberal arts has come back. The Lutheran reformers approached the question of education from the vantage point of biblical theology. The Scriptures informed what the students were to study, as well as when and how they were to be taught. They established a curriculum guide for subjects with scope and sequence. Teachers were given methods with which to teach. All of it was rooted in the evangelical catechesis with the liberal arts so that the baptized children might be educated for vocations in church or society, serving their neighbors. The early Lutheran schools in America through present day. And some of this Dr. Nolan also noted yesterday. In 1847, the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, what would become known as the LCMS, was founded. Synod's constitution made provisions for Lutheran education. One of the reasons given for forming the synod included making school books available to synodical schools. A condition under which a congregation may join synod and remain a member included that it provide Lutheran catechesis for the children of the congregation. The synodical president was required by synod to visit the congregations and schools and to include in a report whether he found such school books containing anything contrary to the confession of the true faith. An article in the Constitution explained the examination by the local pastor of teaching candidates for the school in their parish. The teacher candidate was to be examined by the local pastor in these subjects: knowledge of the Bible and understanding of the Scripture, Christian doctrine, with particular reference to the symbolical books, especially the two catechisms of Luther, Church and Reformation history, German language, arithmetic, penmanship, geography, history, and music. In other words, they were to be theologians. It is worth noting that the school subjects of Synod's 19th century American Constitution and Luther's 16th century German curriculum, while catechesis in the Scriptures and the Catechism remained in Synod's Constitution, Latin was omitted, as well as the rich literature of Ovid, Cicero, and the like. Also, no mention is made of logic or rhetoric. The American Lutheran schools that Synod sought to establish were modeled after the 19th century state-sponsored schools in Germany they had left behind. In other words, these schools in Germany had already started to put away the liberal arts by this time, 1847. The Lutheran Reformation's liberal arts education had begun to erode. The liberal arts remained for pastoral education. So you could find the liberal arts here in America. And also remained in congregational schools where the gymnasium educator, that is the German word for liberal arts, pastor was also the Lutheran school teacher. And a little poking around led me to find a dissertation by a guy named William Kirchhoff, who said that Leah's, call it Leah's Seminary, the Fort Wayne Seminary, the first Lutheran school teachers in Indiana were all Lutheran pastors. But the American trained Lutheran school teachers knew little to nothing of the liberal arts. I think that was pointed out, maybe not directly, but look at the curriculum that Martin showed us yesterday. 1864, Lindemann. In 1846, 1 year prior to the founding of Synod, the Fort Wayne Seminary was founded. What may be little known is the fact that along with pastors, teachers were also trained there at the same time until 1864. In 1864, the Teachers College was moved to the Addison Teachers Seminary, and in 1913, it was moved again to River Forest, Illinois. There is much interesting history during this time of Synod, but I would especially like for us to continue tracking Luther and Melanchthon's liberal arts education and its decline in the LCMS. With this in mind, let's take a closer look at Reverend J.C.W. Lindemann. Lindemann was 37 years old when he accepted the call as director and professor of the Addison Teachers Seminary. The account of his appointment is of interest to us. Lindemann had been nominated for the position along with several others, and his name appeared in Der Lutheraner on April 15, 1864. Seeing his name, Lindemann promptly wrote to the Synodical president, C.F.W. Walther. He wrote to decline the nomination and set forth 6 reasons that he felt were compelling reasons to be removed from nomination. Among these reasons were Lindemann's concern that the director at the recently closed Fort Wayne Seminary, a guy by the name of Sell, that he was being overlooked. Even more, Lindemann argued that Sell was more qualified and had greater experience. Finally, Lindemann argued that he would decline the call if it was given because he did not believe that he was academically qualified. Lindemann expressed to Walther that someone with a liberal arts education would be better suited for the job. I think Lindemann was right. In Germany, Lindemann had attended school until he was 14 years old, but his family could not afford a gymnasium education. After arriving in America, Lindemann's formal education for preparation as teacher and pastor was less than 2 years. Thus, we can sympathize with Lindemann's apprehension. Nevertheless, after the call came, Lindemann accepted the position as the new director and professor at Addison Teachers Seminary. After encouragement to do so in a letter from Synod's president, it was a post that Lindemann held for 15 years until his death in 1879. The well-known Schulblatt was Lindemann's periodical that was sent out like the Der Lutheraner. Luther and Melanchthon's liberal arts education did not get much of a start in the earliest days of the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states. Although many elements of a liberal arts education remained in training pastors at the seminary. While early teacher training lacked the liberal arts curriculum, what did remain is a clear and unwavering commitment to Lutheran catechesis, the scriptures, the Lutheran confessions, doctrinally pure school books, and theologically sound Lutheran educators. I do not think that we can in any way, shape, or form put down Lindemann for his desire to have a solid Lutheran education. 20th century America brought a new wave of thinking in public and private education. Education was driven by science, research, rather than the long-standing liberal arts. The scientific process, we might say follow the science today, was viewed as theologically neutral, and its objective data as more reliable, useful, and practical in informing decisions and attitudes about teaching children, more so than Christian theology. What was to be studied and how it was to be known was driven by child-centered psychological principles. The theory of evolution dehumanized those who learned and those who taught, and suggested that mankind would make the best progress through well-studied, scientifically measured behavioral learning objectives. Since children were believed to be naturally good and innocent, they were to discover their own learning rather than being taught by pedagogues. Influential educational movers and shakers included John Dewey, who introduced and normalized the ideology of progressive education, was a self-acclaimed atheist, and was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. Lev Vygotsky was a Marxist-Leninist educational revolutionary under Joseph Stalin, who attempted to establish a new Soviet man via school reform. Vygotsky was anti-Christian and sought to establish educational psychological principles whereby children worked together collectively, striving toward harmony and social constructivism, i.e., group work. We still have it today. There were also the likes of Horace Mann, Maria Montessori, Jean Piaget, Frederick Froebel. By the way, it was mentioned yesterday about Frederick Froebel in kindergarten. He has a similar story to Nietzsche. I was raised in a devout Lutheran home with a Lutheran pastor father, but later left Lutheranism and came under the influence of a guy named Pestalozzi, who adhered to the idea that mankind had no original sin and that we were all born naturally good. And it goes bad, worse from there. Ben Bloom and many others. As time went on, new pedagogues built on the foundation established by these and spread new ideas and theologies that instituted in American education the rejection of truth, the rejection of original sin, godly authority, Christian catechesis, and much more. I appreciated the comment last night about how Christianity is actually viewed as the perpetrator of evil. It's exactly, it's not a new thought. Thomas Korchak, in his book, Serpents in the Classroom, an excellent book, by the way, maintains, quote, the theological premises upon which their pedagogical ideas were built still remain. Wayne Schmidt notes, quote, even as public schools were reshaping themselves at the end of the 19th century, so also Lutheran parochial schools would have to redesign their curricula. That's my point right there. And Schmidt wasn't for or against all of this. He just simply states the obvious. A primary and formal way for these ideologies to enter LCMS schools came via Synod's colleges seeking accreditation from regional accrediting agencies whose standards reflected the new American secularism. While Synod had at first viewed school accreditation as an, quote, unwholesome mixing of church and state and a potential compromise of principle, by 1919, Concordia Seward was accredited and preparing Lutheran teachers for state certification by 1920. By 1950, Concordia Teachers College in River Forest was accredited by the Department of Public Instruction in the state of Illinois and was subsequently accredited by the North Central Association of Colleges and Secondary Schools. The impact of a secular education in LCMS parochial schools was not likely immediate, nor, to be generous, pursued to undermine the Orthodox Lutheran confession. I don't think that's true. Yet, slowly but surely, the new American educational theories and practices made their way throughout synodical colleges and LCMS parochial schools. To my knowledge, today, every Concordia is accredited, and every Concordia with a teacher education program in the LCMS teaches to their state's certification curriculum. Make no mistake, that teacher education curriculum is replete with educational philosophies that are godless, secular humanism. I had that education. I can tell you from firsthand experience. It was Dewey, Mann, Piaget, and others that I studied while preparing to be a Lutheran school teacher in the early 90s at a college in the Concordia University system. I was taught the theories and pedagogies of the 20th century educational thinkers. As far as I knew, education began in 1900 and little before then was of any practical use. I do not ever recall reading Luther, Melanchthon, or Bugenhagen on education in my studies. And I say that in case someone said, well, it was in the curriculum, you just weren't paying attention. It certainly wasn't emphasized. The goal was state teacher licensure. That was the goal. The teacher training curriculum was designed to pass the state teacher certification exam. It's what we were doing. In 1978, the LCMS established National Lutheran School Accreditation. Accreditation acknowledges that Lutheran schools today utilize a great variety of curriculum models. Many of these models are used by a variety of both public and non-public schools. LCMS schools that are accredited by the National Lutheran School Accreditation Commission are not required to utilize a particular model of education. Rather, standards for accreditation establish guidelines for curriculum and instruction. While not all schools in the LCMS are accredited by the NLSA, actually a very small percentage are accredited by NLSA. Its accreditation benchmarks address the vast majority of curriculum models in nearly all of our present-day LCMS schools. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, I served on an LCMS district's accreditation commission. NLSA required that Lutheran teachers be state certified. The state certification process included language that insinuated children were by nature good, contrary to the doctrine of original sin. After lodging a complaint, the district gave our school a pass on requiring our teachers to be state certified, but the standard was not removed from NLSA requirements. Of course, I was thankful for the exception. Yet many LCMS schools were following and continue to follow Synod standards and are requiring teachers in LCMS parochial schools to be state certified. NLSA still requires state teacher certification in order to be accredited. One of my Lutheran school teachers last week sent me a picture from a Lutheran school posting for a job. And the only requirements that were listed for the teacher is that they have COVID-19 vaccination and be state certified. That was it. Nothing else was listed. Consider an example from the current NLSA standards. Standard 5 in the NLSA self-study addresses teaching and learning. And I quote from the standard. Learning expectations for schools are profoundly different today than even a decade ago. Schools must be institutions of creativity, imagination, and innovation. Key to success is the investment of time, thought, energy, and resources toward desired educational outcomes. By the way, this is all loaded jargon, okay? Student learning requires the integration of a well-developed curriculum and instructional design supported by intentional and ongoing assessment. That was introduced by the behavioral psychologists late 1800s, early 1900s. When teaching, learning, and assessment are correctly aligned and students are engaged, learning results. That's a very scientific way to approach education. In this way, they say, Lutheran schools accomplish one of their primary objectives. That's the end of my quote. NLSA acknowledges how quickly teaching strategies and curricula have changed even in the last 10 years. I couldn't agree more. The accredited school must be creative and innovative, they say. That may imply even more changes in teaching and curricula in the near future. They say that the school must also make curriculum and instruction decisions based upon, quote, intentional and ongoing assessment. Students, parents, community partners are suggested as those who should have input in designing the curriculum. But are those the best resources for deciding what is and what is not to be taught in our LCMS parochial schools? Are students, community members, or even many parents able to discern a uniquely confessional Lutheran curriculum? The basic subjects included in NLSA standards are religion, mathematics, science, reading, language arts, social studies. Social studies, we could have a whole paper on that. Art, music, and physical education. Schools are not limited to these basic subjects. I would presume that many of our Lutheran high schools are also teaching foreign language and computer application as well. Some junior high and elementary schools may do the same. schools are encouraged to consider 21st century methodologies in teaching these subjects. For example, the accredited school must provide an answer to this question in their application. Describe, I guess it's not a question, but describe the 21st century methodology in place at the school and elaborate on how it impacts student learning. For example, these examples are given: global awareness, financial and entrepreneurial literacy, civil literacy, health literacy, environmental literacy, etc. Can you define any of the 21st century methodologies? The evidence-based accreditation model adopted in 2018 by NLSA included a variety of terms that were foreign to district education executives and Lutheran school administrators and teachers. I just happened to be there when these were rolled out in St. Louis. They didn't know what any of these terms meant. The NLSA put together a helpful then glossary of terms to find out what they meant, to assist schools in meeting the new standards it had established. For instance, global awareness involves recognition and appreciation of the size, complexity, and diversity of the earth conceived as a single entity. Financial and entrepreneurial literacy is knowing how to make appropriate economic choices, understanding the role of the economy in society, using entrepreneurial skills to enhance the workplace, productivity, and career choices. Schools employing methodologies in environmental literacy demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the environment and the circumstances and conditions affecting it, particularly as it relates to air, climate, land, food, energy, water, and ecosystems. And I think you can read a whole lot of verbiage into these. Demonstrates knowledge and understanding of society's impact on the natural world. Eating that prime rib probably does not qualify under this standard. Population growth and development, resource consumption rate, etc. You can read the rest of them there. According to the NLSA, the Lutheran school may use a variety of resources to construct the curriculum. For example, they may use state mandates. They may use Common Core curriculum. There was a paper written, by the way, encouraging the Common Core curriculum, local public school curriculum, integrating the faith, standardized test objectives, and results analysis, etc. NLSA standards do clearly state the teaching of the Christian faith is recognized as the major purpose of the school. So that is in the document. Certainly, Christian language is included in the NLSA standards. Yet, this uniquely Lutheran language cannot be found. Catechesis, catechism, hymnal, Lutheran confessions cannot be found. Religion is given as a required subject, and other language requires that the school is to be Christ-centered, but the uniquely Lutheran resources of the Bible, catechism, and hymnal are never mentioned. The 21st century curriculum includes subjects from the earliest schools of the LCMS and 16th century Germany. For example, teaching of the Christian faith, reading, writing, and arithmetic. What has dramatically changed is the methodologies and content of those subject areas. Not all of our Lutheran schools still utilize Luther's Small Catechism and a Lutheran hymnal to teach the Christian faith, although the scriptures remain in our Lutheran schools to varying degrees. I think that there are a lot of Bible study materials that are being used that may not be so faithful. Core subject areas include methodologies never known among Lutherans in 16th century Germany or even in 20th century America, such as global awareness, financial and entrepreneurial literacy, civic literacy, health literacy, and environmental literacy. On the LCMS webpage under school ministry, a number of reasons are given for why you should send your children to a Lutheran school. It says Lutheran schools are driven by a commitment to the gospel, focused on a mission of bringing hope and healing to students and families. Secondly, are governed by board members who clearly understand their roles and focus on the vision and board policies that effectively govern the operation of the school. Number three, meet or exceed state and national academic standards at all grade levels. You see connection to the state right there. Have educators who model visionary leadership. They practice stewardship of resources, build up others, and empathize with others. These have educators who model servant leadership. Do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? And that's a quote from a guy named Robert Greenleaf. It's on the webpage. Have educators who model spiritual leadership. They study God's word, share their personal faith story, apply law and gospel appropriately, exhibit a passion for ministry, act courageously, equip God's people for service, care for others, demonstrate integrity, and pray. I think some of those we could go along with. Here's some questions I ask. Should Lutheran schools be driven by a commitment to the gospel or a confession of the gospel? Is there anything more important than every board member clearly holding to confessional Lutheran theology in word and deed? No, there's nothing more important than that. Why should state and national academic standards matter to a Lutheran school who rejects the premises and false theologies of state and national education? Is visionary leadership a term that is descriptive of Lutheran schools that live in the world but are not of the world? And what does Robert Greenleaf, a Quaker, know about the office of Lutheran educator? If we are going to flesh out, quote, spiritual leadership, end quote, as a descriptor of educators, why not also require that they are Lutheran confessors of Christ, as he is revealed in the scriptures and confessed in the Lutheran symbols? And the last part here, a way forward. In 1999, a small group of Lutheran pastors and laymen met in Colorado Springs, Colorado. These recognized that our LCMS parochial schools had lost their uniquely Lutheran culture. They were Lutheran theologians who cared deeply about catechizing children through a diligent study of the scriptures, memorizing and confessing Luther's small catechism, singing the Orthodox Lutheran hymns, and Lutheran worship. Their approach was to bring the best of the confessional Lutheran educational reforms of the 16th century into the present day. The approach would not be a cut and paste, but rather a sincere application of their theology in a contemporary setting. That was exactly what Luther, Melanchthon, and Bugenhagen did. They practiced evangelical Lutheran theology coupled with the old liberal arts in the German schools of their day. These schools have come to be known as classical Lutheran schools. They are marked by their unwavering pursuit of confessional Lutheran catechesis and the liberal arts. Matins and Vespers are prayed as a school community. Students recite all of Luther's catechism, small catechism, memorize hymns and the scriptures, study English and Latin grammar, are drilled in the rudiments of logic and rhetoric, read the great authors that the students of Bugenhagen read, and are well versed in mathematics, geometry, music, and astronomy. Just a comment on memorizing. We had our third graders at our school recite the Athanasian Creed. In classical Lutheran schools, the teachers are confessional Lutherans who are not required to be state certified. Rather, they pursue an alternative certification from the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education, where they must write theological papers on topics such as sin and grace, justification, law and gospel, teaching the scriptures Christocentrically, Lutheran catechesis, and the office of the Lutheran educator. In classical Lutheran schools, teachers embrace the old curriculum of antiquity and become experts at sniffing out and purging godless, secular, humanistic education. Faculties study the Lutheran confessions together throughout the year. Teachers are expected to know the subjects they teach and instruct students in such a way that they know the good, the true, and the beautiful are from the triune God and reflect and lead back to Him. Confessional Lutheran schools are also accredited by the CCLE and are expected to have confessional Lutheran board members, teachers, and administrators. Many have Lutheran pastors as headmasters and teachers. After all, who better to be the school's primary catechist than the called and ordained Lutheran pastor? Schools with generic pan-Christian religion classes are not accredited and are asked to implement a Lutheran catechetical curriculum with the Bible, catechism, and hymnal as the core textbooks. Art beautifies classrooms and hallways. Students learn to play instruments well, and the church's future organists and cantors are being secured. We have several in our high school who play the organ. Not all of them are going to be Lutheran pastors or teachers. One of them is going to be a chemist. These are the Lutheran schools that are needed today, even in every generation. These schools are Lutheran catechetical schools that raise up the baptized and prepare them for service in the family, church, and society. And I repent of not including family in that list earlier. I should have. Family is important. Young boys are taught to be husbands and fathers. Young girls are taught to be wives and mothers. These are places where it is considered imperative that everyone know and believe and live in the truth that marriage is God's institution given for one man and one woman for a lifetime, to live out their baptized lives in raising Lutheran children. Pastors are cultivated in these schools, and so are faithful laymen in all useful and God-pleasing arts and service to the church and the world. Conclusion. Synod's 2019 Blue Ribbon Report enumerates additional items with which Lutheran schools are struggling. This paper, I want to make this clear, is not completely dismissing many of those things. Indeed, much can and should be said about them, how to finance Lutheran schools and all that. These are important questions. Detractors may posit that simply fixing the Lutheran catechesis in our schools will do little good to resolve the struggles in our schools. Others may point to deficiencies in leadership, financing, facilities, enrollment, and the like within faithful catechetical Lutheran schools. Those things are happening. They may be correct. I will leave them to defend their own positions. The purpose of this paper has been to take up the topic most near and dear to the very core and being of Lutheran schools, namely Lutheran catechesis. If we cannot get that right, then the other things are not worth our time. Johannes Bugenhagen's motto summarizes Lutheran catechetical distinction of Lutheran schools very well. Si Jesum bene skis satis est, sic hetera nescis. Si Jesum nescis nihil est, quod hetera discis. If you know Jesus well, it is sufficient if you do not know other things. If you do not know Jesus, it is nothing if you learn other things. Thank you.
Hello, Alex Lancaster, lay delegate from Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Albany, Oregon. So I've been a music teacher from the elementary up to the collegiate level, and I'm working on a master's in theology, and I would love to teach in a Lutheran school. My question is, given the struggling financial state of some of these schools, as someone with a wife to take care of, and I hope to have children, I couldn't in good conscience take some of the jobs being offered where it's full-time for $18,000 a year with no benefits. And I understand the financial constraints, but I just couldn't do it. So how do we balance that? I've got friends who are in the same position, getting offered jobs, and they can't take them, even though they want to teach these kids.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I thought that since the previous presenter said ask Pastor Kieser, I would say ask Pastor Preuss. But this is why I said that I don't deny that some of these are real issues financing our schools. Just a couple thoughts. One, you probably have a lot of debt. I'm just guessing. You don't have any debt? Oh, God be praised. We need to talk to you about how to do that. But the salaries and so forth within our Lutheran schools, I think, are a problem. I agree with that. I'm not convinced that the vouchers and so forth are the right way forward at all. What I say over and over again at our school is Lutherans must finance Lutheran education. And that means that we simply have to step up to the plate and find creative ways. I don't have all the answers, and we struggle as well as many other schools do. And I do know that it's even almost assumed that once you get out of a Concordia, you may make less than $40,000. At Concordia University, Nebraska, you are enrolled in what's called LRAP. LRAP is some sort of insurance plan that if you make under $40,000 a year after you get out of college, they'll either help pay or fully pay your expenses for college. I think part of it is a cheaper way through college, which we're going to hear about. And the others, I think we need to have maybe a conference on that. I don't have all the answers.
Thank you for your paper. Who is on that 2013 committee of the Synod Convention that they appointed that reported then in 2019? And then also, what is the NLSA governing board? Who are they made up of? Are we just simply, I'm suspecting, just our own, evaluating our own?
I don't remember all the names. If you follow the link in my paper, it will take you to the report. The Synod's report is online, and you can read the list of names. I do know that one person that I knew personally, Cheryl Swope, was on the committee. And so that's the only person that I know. The other thing is the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education has partnered with NLSA, so you should know that. Schools accredited by, we have a written agreement that schools accredited by our association or our consortium may be accredited by NLSA. Because NLSA has such a diverse acceptance of kinds of schools, the classical schools fit underneath their very, very broad umbrella. And so one approach has been, and there are all these approaches to how to solve problems in Synod. Do you try to, retain your own identity while also working with Synod, trying to, what do you do? That's kind of the approach thus far that we've had. I do think that there are some very solid people that are involved with the NLSA, and so I don't want to completely dismiss the NLSA. I was talking with Dr. Nolan about this. It seems to me that Missouri Synod has been infected with this idea that that somehow or another we're inferior and we have to be like our public school counterparts. And in doing so, we think that it's neutral or that we can do it, and we don't realize the effect that it has upon us. And I think that would be, if a member of the NLSA board were sitting here today, that's what I would suggest to them. And what we need to do is get realigned and realize how far off course I think that we've gotten. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
If I might respond to your response to Alex concerning financing, you said something like Lutherans have to support Lutherans. And I fully agree with that. I think we have to define wide or narrow sense when we're talking about Lutherans, though. I do believe we need to come up with some way to finance genuinely Orthodox Lutheran school teachers. I know our congregation is ready and willing to do that, but identifying the recipients is a concern. And so just, the Concordia University system as a whole, they're not as ready to jump on board with that. But I think there are others too. We're not unique. I think if we could find some leadership people who have some financial backgrounds and understanding, that we could really develop a support for genuinely Lutheran school teachers so that they might do their vocation.
I think we're going to hear about that a little bit in the next presentation, but I will also add that the CCLE has worked with 3 Concordias in particular, and those Concordias have established at least routes for classical Lutheran education, separate from state teacher certification, a study of the liberal arts, and Lutheran catechesis. That includes your very own Concordia, Nebraska, under Dr. Haley and Matt Phillips. Those 2 men are leading the charge there. Also at Concordia University, Wisconsin, and I know there's been talk about that, with partnerships with Susan Mobley, and also Angus Manouge. And under Korchak at Concordia University, Chicago, and I don't know who will be taking the leadership there since Korchak has left. Concordia Chicago actually listed as one of their 7 strategies or 7, I don't know what they called them, under guard, and it's unfortunate that he wasn't able to be here, but under guard listed these 7 pursuits, and one of them was the pursuit of classical Lutheran education and raising up educators. And that's still in there on paper. We'll see what happens.
I want to thank you for your paper. I think it was an excellent paper, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. And I'm thinking yesterday, we heard that pastors used to teach children and on top of their other pastoral duties. I was just thinking, let's maybe think outside the box. Maybe pastors could offer some time every day to young people who want to come after school and do an hour's worth of classical education with them, liberal arts education with them, or leaders in congregations. Could you or do you know of a curriculum that could be used for such a desire?
Do I know of an after-school curriculum that can be instituted? No, I don't know of one.
Could you make one?
I think that if we wish to pursue the liberal arts, then we must be educated in the liberal arts. We have to go back and read what our forefathers read, and we need to see them in light of the scriptures and confessions. So one thing I would offer, if you haven't already, is that I would go back and actually get a reading list and start reading and become educated. And then it happens this way. I think a lot of classical education, we can thank home education. They also were leading the way, and Lutheran schools also now are catching on. But I think what happens at the home is that my wife and I home educated for 8 years. Sometimes you're just a chapter ahead, or you're on the same sentence as the kids are on, but at least you're getting through that education. And then the next year you do it again and you do it again. So one suggestion I would make is become a well-educated person and then teach out of the fullness of your own education to your children. Just teach them what you know and have them read what you've read. And in that way you can develop your own without a list from me, would be a suggestion.
One last question.
Thank you, Pastor Kieser, for your presentation. Craig Niemeyer from Zion Worms. I've been blessed for 15 years to serve a congregation immediately north of here. Their heart and their soul has been from its very founding in 1874, Catechesis, teaching the faith. And you've mentioned a couple times in your presentation an unintentional oversight of the home, and then have explicitly reminded us of the power and the importance of the home in catechesis and in Lutheran schools. Just a question to kind of expand on that a little bit more in terms of what our Lutheran schools can do to be intentional about including specifically the head of the household in this God-pleasing given work. My just general observations has been sometimes the challenge. We support Lutheran education at the elementary and high school mindset to say, well, we've got the professionals now. We're going to let the pastor and the teacher drop it off. We're constantly searching for ways to encourage mom and dad to be intentional about their calling as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you brought up two things there that I wish we had more time to talk about. Maybe we can take it up in the panel discussion. But one is, I think the immediate reaction of many schools to home education was to reject them flat out. They saw them as a threat to the school, either as a paying entity or, wow, you guys are choosing another form of Lutheran education. You must not think that we're doing what we should be doing. And maybe the answer to that question is, yes, we do think that you're not doing what we think you ought to be doing. But I have found that the home educators in our area are willing to partner with us, and they're coming to us and asking, can we play sports? Can we be in your music program? Can we take a math class? And especially as children get older, because it's harder to teach all things, especially if you have a large household. We have 7 children, and so to try to teach one how to read and the other one, trying to be reading something else, it can be very difficult. And so they have been relying upon our schools, and I think our schools need to be open to that and find ways to include home educators, not as our foes, but as our partners in education. So I would definitely embrace them and not turn them away. The second thing that you brought up is the whole issue with Lutheran school teacher and pastor. And there's a lot that can be said about this, but this is one thing that I've noticed as a former Lutheran school teacher. I shouldn't say former because I'm still teaching, and also pastor. One thing that I think has happened, and I just use teacher certification as an example. If I have state teaching certification and the pastor doesn't, I'm a professional and you're not. So it says, because I'm a professional educator and you don't have that state teaching licensure, I know how to teach and you don't know how to teach. That's the presumption, which is a false presumption. I mean, the scriptures say that pastors should be able to teach. Now, whether you can teach algebra or not is another question, but you should be able to teach if you're a pastor. Paul says so, Ephesians 4, right? Pastors and teachers, that you are to be a teaching pastor. So this is one of the many things. We could have another little talk on this about why I think the professional Lutheran state licensed school teacher has separated themselves from the office of pastor, and that the pastor is only good for preaching the sermon, which really is good for everything that is needful, but you can't enter the classroom because you don't have certification. I think we need to turn that around And one way to do that is the suggestion I just gave to the pastor previously. Become well educated in some of these subjects. And I know we're all caught up with amounts of time, but I think it behooves us to become a liberally educated man in our schools and to be able to speak to these issues in our schools. So the pastor should not be excluded from the classroom, that he should be included in the classroom. And I think it would be good, and I know you're all busy, I'm busy too, but teach a class in the school. Teach a literature class on top of teaching the Bible, and show them how the scriptures can be brought into a literature class. I teach Algebra 1. I've also taught biology and physics and other things at our school. How do we confess the faith in and through also these subjects? That they are not theologically neutral, that these subjects are indeed, in fact, grounded and should be seen in and through God's Word. So that would be my one suggestion to you, Pastor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pastor.